The millionaire met a widow on a plane. He was stunned to realize they have the same daughter. Ethan Blake was used to luxury, but not to calm. As the founder of one of the world's most successful tech companies, his life was a whirlwind of boardrooms, business deals, and flashing cameras. Boarding a first-class flight to New York, he hoped to catch a rare moment of peace before another series of high-stakes meetings. Yet, peace was the last thing he would find. Sliding into his plush seat, Ethan noticed the woman beside him almost immediately. Her presence wasn't loud or demanding, but it was magnetic. Dressed in a soft, emerald green cashmere sweater, with a delicate strand of pearls around her neck, she exuded an air of quiet elegance. Her honey-brown hair was swept into a loose bun, and her eyes, calm but shadowed, hinted at a story Ethan couldn't yet fathom. "Busy flight," she remarked with a polite smile, nodding at the bustling cabin. "Always is," Ethan replied, his voice tinged with fatigue. The pleasantries could have ended there, but something about her intrigued him. He had met countless women in his life, powerful executives, dazzling socialites, even the occasional Hollywood star, but there was something refreshingly grounded about this stranger. When the plane took off, he found himself turning to her again. "I'm Ethan, by the way," he said, extending a hand. "Amelia," she replied, her handshake firm but warm. "Amelia Warren." They fell into easy conversation. Amelia revealed that she was a widow, traveling to New York for a conference on philanthropy. Her late husband, Thomas, had passed away 5 years ago, leaving her to raise their daughter, Sophie, alone. Ethan found himself listening more than speaking, a rarity for him. "Your daughter must be proud of you," Ethan said, genuinely impressed by Amelia's calm resilience. "She is," Amelia said, her eyes softening. "Sophie's my everything. She's 21 now, in college, studying art. She's got her father's creativity and my stubbornness, a dangerous combination." Ethan chuckled, but his mind drifted for a moment. 21? Art. A pang of memory stirred within him, though he couldn't quite place it. He shook it off and redirected the conversation. As their conversation deepened, Amelia asked about him, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan found himself opening up. He spoke about his rise from a modest background, his relentless drive to build his empire, and the toll it had taken on his personal life. "Success comes at a cost," he admitted, his tone uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Sometimes I wonder if I paid too high a price." Amelia regarded him thoughtfully. "We all make sacrifices for the lives we choose," she said gently. "But it's never too late to find balance." Ethan nodded, appreciating her insight more than he expected. For the rest of the flight, they talked about everything: books, travel, their favorite cities. Amelia's laugh was light and infectious, and Ethan realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this at ease. As the plane began its descent, Ethan couldn't help but feel a strange sense of loss at the thought of parting ways. Amelia scribbled her number on a piece of paper and handed it to him. "In case you're ever in need of a new friend," she said with a wink. Ethan pocketed the note with a smile, watching as Amelia disappeared into the crowd at the terminal. Little did he know, their brief meeting was just the beginning of a journey that would unravel secrets neither of them could have imagined. Ethan Blake was not the kind of man to dwell on chance encounters, yet Amelia Warren lingered in his thoughts long after they parted. Her voice, her laughter, the way her eyes softened when she talked about her daughter, they had left an impression. He found himself pulling out her number more than once, considering calling her just to hear that calm, melodic voice again. But for reasons he couldn't explain, he hesitated. The next day, as he sat in his Manhattan penthouse, a text notification lit up his phone. It was from an unfamiliar number, but the message made his heart skip a beat. "Hi, Ethan, it's Amelia. I wanted to share a picture of my daughter, Sophie. I realized after our conversation that I didn't have a single recent photo of myself to send. Here's the person I talk about far too much." Attached was a photo of a young woman in her early 20s standing in a sunlit field. She had wavy chestnut hair, an easy smile, and strikingly familiar green eyes. Ethan's breath hitched. He stared at the photo, his mind racing. Sophie Warren looked exactly like his daughter, Sophie Blake. The similarities weren't just passing, her high cheekbones, the slight dimple in her left cheek, and even the way her eyes sparkled with mischief. It was uncanny. It was like seeing a ghost from a life he had buried long ago. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. Could this really be a coincidence? The name Sophie, the resemblance, it seemed impossible. Yet logic fought against his growing unease. Sophie Blake had been his daughter. She still was, somewhere in the world, though their connection had been severed long ago. 15 years earlier, his divorce from Rachel had been the darkest chapter of his life. The love they once shared had withered under the weight of his ambition. When Rachel walked away, she took Sophie with her. At the time, Ethan had convinced himself that stepping back was best for all of them. He hadn't even fought for custody, telling himself it was for Sophie's stability. But in truth, he'd been too focused on building his empire to be the father she needed. For years, he had tried to suppress the guilt. His occasional attempts to reconnect with Sophie had been met with silence, and eventually, he stopped trying. Sophie had become a distant memory, a part of a life he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Until now. Ethan picked up his phone and reread Amelia's message. He had to know more. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he finally typed back. Amelia, thank you for sharing this. Sophie is beautiful, just as you described her. If it's not too much to ask, could I know a little more about her? Her age, where she grew up? The response came almost immediately. Of course. She's 21, turning 22 in February. We adopted her when she was a toddler, just 2 years old. She's our miracle, really. Thomas and I struggled to have children of our own, so Sophie was a blessing in every sense of the word. We raised her in Connecticut, though she's been living on campus in Rhode Island for college. Adopted. The word echoed in Ethan's mind like a thunderclap. If Sophie Warren was adopted at 2 years old, there was a probability that she and Sophie Blake were one and the same. But how? Why hadn't Rachel told him? Ethan's pulse quickened as he pieced together the timeline. Rachel must have placed Sophie for adoption after their divorce. But why? She had always seemed determined to shield Sophie from him, but to give her up entirely? Ethan's hands trembled as he stared at the photo on his phone. Could it really be her? Could this young woman, raised by a stranger, be the daughter he had lost? For the first time in years, Ethan felt a mix of emotions he could barely contain. Hope, fear, anger, and a desperate need for answers. He knew one thing for certain: this was no coincidence. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that fate was playing a cruel trick on him. Sitting in his sleek, minimalist penthouse, he stared at the photo Amelia had sent, his mind running in circles. Was it really possible? Could this Sophie, with her warm smile and familiar eyes, be the same little girl he had last seen over a decade ago? No. He picked up his phone, scrolling through his saved photos until he found an old, grainy image from years ago. It was the last picture he had of Sophie Blake, taken on her 7th birthday. She was grinning, her missing front teeth on full display, holding a brightly wrapped gift. He compared the photo to the one Amelia had sent. The resemblance was undeniable. Even as a grown woman, Sophie Warren had the same dimpled smile, the same mischievous glint in her eyes. The more he stared, the more convinced he became. But how could this be possible? If Sophie Warren was his daughter, why was she living a life completely disconnected from him? Why hadn't Rachel told him she had placed their daughter for adoption? Ethan's head spun with questions, and he knew there was only one person who could give him answers: Amelia. He dialed her number, his hands uncharacteristically shaky. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and inviting. Ethan, how nice to hear from you. I hope I didn't catch you at a bad time. Not at all, he said, trying to keep his tone casual. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation on the plane. And, well, about Sophie. There's something about her that feels familiar to me. Could I ask you a few more questions about her?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, but Amelia's voice remained kind. "Of course, Ethan. Is everything all right?" He hesitated. "I'm not sure yet. You mentioned that Sophie was adopted. Do you know anything about her biological parents?" Amelia sighed softly. "Not much, I'm afraid. The adoption was closed, and Thomas and I were given very little information. All we know is that her biological mother was young and couldn't provide for her at the time. She made the difficult decision to give Sophie up so she could have a better life." Ethan swallowed hard, his chest tightening. It all fit. Rachel must have been overwhelmed after their divorce and decided she couldn't raise Sophie alone. But why hadn't she told him? Why had she made such a life-altering decision without even giving him the chance to step in? "Amelia," he began cautiously, "this might sound strange, but I think I might know something about Sophie's biological family." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "What do you mean?" "I think Sophie might be my daughter," Ethan admitted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I had a daughter named Sophie Blake. After my divorce, her mother and I lost touch. I never knew what happened to her, but the timeline, the resemblance, it's too much to ignore." Amelia didn't respond immediately, and the silence stretched on long enough for Ethan to wonder if he had overstepped. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "That's a lot to take in," she said carefully. "You're saying Sophie could be your biological daughter? Ethan, this isn't something I can just dismiss, but it's also not something I can confirm. Sophie's adoption was private, and we've never had any contact with her birth family." "I understand," Ethan said quickly, sensing her apprehension. "I don't want to disrupt her life or cause any pain, but if there's even a chance that she's my daughter, I need to know. I've already lost so much time." Amelia's tone softened. "Ethan, I can see how much this means to you. But Sophie doesn't know she's adopted. Thomas and I always intended to tell her when the time was right, but after he passed, it never felt like the right moment. She's built her entire identity on the life we gave her. If this is true, it could turn her world upside down." Ethan's heart sank. He hadn't considered that Sophie might not even know the truth about her origins. Would she resent him for bringing it up? Would she reject him outright? "I don't want to hurt her," he said finally. "I just want a chance to know her." Amelia's voice softened further. "Let me think about how to approach this. If Sophie is your daughter, she deserves to know the truth, but it has to be on her terms." Ethan thanked her, knowing he had no choice but to wait. As he hung up, he felt a mix of hope and dread. For the first time in years, he was on the verge of reconnecting with the most important person he'd ever lost. But at what cost? And what would Sophie think when she learned the truth? Ethan couldn't sit still. After his conversation with Amelia, he knew he needed more information before taking another step. The idea of Sophie being his daughter was too overwhelming to leave to speculation. The only way forward was to uncover the truth. Late into the night, Ethan sat at his desk, the city lights of Manhattan twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. His mind was a storm of emotions: guilt for his past mistakes, hope for a second chance, and fear of what might come if he was wrong. He opened his laptop and began searching for adoption records, but as expected, most were sealed. Without more details, he couldn't find much. Frustrated, he leaned back in his chair and called his assistant, Claire. Claire had been with him for years, handling everything from his packed schedule to the occasional crisis. She answered on the first ring, her voice crisp despite the late hour. "Mr. Blake, is everything all right?" she asked. "Not exactly," he said, hesitating for a moment. "I need you to do something for me, and it's a bit unconventional." There was a pause before Claire replied. "I'm listening." Ethan explained the situation, keeping his tone measured but urgent. He told her about his suspicions that Sophie Warren might be the daughter he had lost contact with years ago. "Claire," ever professional, didn't question his motives. I'll need Amelia Warren's late husband's full name and any details about Sophie's adoption to trace it, Claire said. I'll text you the information I have, Ethan replied. But Claire, this has to stay between us. You can count on me, she assured him. The next morning, Claire called him back. Her voice was steady, but there was a hint of surprise. I found something, she said. Thomas Warren, Amelia's late husband, passed away 5 years ago, as she said. But before they married, Thomas was a sperm donor for a fertility clinic in Connecticut. Ethan frowned. What does that have to do with Sophie? According to the clinic's records, which I shouldn't have accessed, but let's leave that aside, Thomas Warren's genetic material was used in several cases, one of which matches Sophie's adoption timeline. I also checked public records and confirmed that Rachel Blake, your ex-wife, was listed as a client of the same clinic after your divorce. Ethan's breath caught. Are you saying... I'm saying it's possible that Sophie isn't just your biological daughter, Claire said carefully. She might also be Thomas Warren's biological daughter, conceived through Rachel's choice to use a donor. Ethan sat back, his mind reeling. If Claire was right, Sophie was biologically his daughter and the daughter of the man who had raised her. The connection between Amelia and him wasn't just a coincidence. It was woven into Sophie's very existence. Still processing the revelation, Ethan called Amelia. He needed to tell her what he had learned. She answered quickly, her tone a mix of curiosity and concern. Amelia, I found something, Ethan began, trying to steady his voice. It's about Sophie. I think there's a reason she looks so much like me and why I feel such a strong connection to her. Amelia was silent for a moment. What did you find? Thomas was a sperm donor before you married, Ethan explained, and my ex-wife Rachel used a donor from the same clinic to conceive Sophie after our divorce. I think Sophie might be the result of that process. She's biologically my daughter and Thomas's. Amelia's sharp intake of breath was audible. That's impossible. Are you sure? I'm not entirely sure, Ethan admitted, but everything points to it. The clinic records match the timeline, and the resemblance is too strong to ignore. Amelia's voice trembled slightly. Ethan, if what you're saying is true, it changes everything. Not just for you and me, but for Sophie. She's been living her whole life without knowing any of this. I know, Ethan said softly. That's why we have to be careful. I don't want to hurt her, but she has a right to know the truth. Amelia was quiet for a long time before she spoke again. If you're right, this means Sophie is connected to both of us in ways I can't even begin to process. I don't know how she'll react, but I agree. She deserves the truth. Let me talk to her, gently. Thank you, Ethan said, his voice filled with gratitude. I just want to be part of her life, whatever that looks like. Amelia sighed. I need some time to figure out how to approach her. She's strong, but this will be a lot for her to take in. I'll call you once I've spoken to her. As they hung up, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the hardest part was yet to come. How would Sophie react to learning the truth about her origins? Would she reject him, or would she allow him into her life? For the first time in years, Ethan felt vulnerable. His fate now rested in the hands of a young woman who didn't even know he existed. The days following Ethan's conversation with Amelia were agonizing. Every passing hour felt heavier than the last, as he waited for her to speak with Sophie. Despite his wealth and power, Ethan had never felt more helpless. This wasn't a situation he could control or fix with money or influence. It was about people, emotions, and decades of buried truths. Amelia, too, was grappling with the weight of what she had learned. Sophie was her daughter in every way that mattered, but now, Amelia was faced with the unsettling reality that Sophie's origins were tied to two men, one who had raised her and one who had unknowingly fathered her. As much as Amelia cherished Sophie, She knew she couldn't withhold the truth forever. One evening, after much deliberation, Amelia decided to broach the subject. She invited Sophie to their favorite cafe near the art gallery Sophie often visited when she came home from college. The young woman arrived wearing a long coat, her hair swept into a messy bun, her canvas bag slung over one shoulder. She greeted her mother with a warm smile, but Amelia noticed the hint of worry in Sophie's eyes. "Mom, you sounded serious on the phone. Is everything okay?" Sophie asked as she sat down. Amelia hesitated, clasping her hands tightly on the table. "Everything's fine, sweetheart, but there's something I need to talk to you about, something important." Sophie tilted her head, curious now. "What's going on?" Amelia took a deep breath. "Sophie, I've been keeping something from you for a long time. It was never meant to be a secret, but after your dad passed, I didn't know how to bring it up. You're adopted." Sophie froze, her smile faltering. "What?" Amelia reached across the table, placing a hand over Sophie's. "You're my daughter in every way that matters. Your father and I loved you from the moment we saw you, but biologically, you had other parents." Sophie's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "I didn't want you to feel different or disconnected from us," Amelia said softly. "And after your dad died, it just never seemed like the right time." Sophie swallowed hard. "Okay, so who are they? My biological parents?" "That's the part that's complicated," Amelia said, her voice shaking slightly. "Recently, I met someone who thinks he might be connected to you. His name is Ethan Blake. He believes he might be your biological father." Sophie blinked, her mind spinning. "What? How does he even know I exist?" Amelia explained everything. Her chance encounter with Ethan on the plane, the photos she had shared, Ethan's suspicions, and the information about Thomas's sperm donation. Sophie sat in stunned silence, trying to process it all. "So, you're saying my biological father didn't even know I existed until now? And my dad, my real dad, might have been connected to him too?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "Yes," Amelia admitted. "It's a lot to take in, I know. But I thought you deserved to know the truth." Sophie stared down at her coffee, her emotions a chaotic mix of anger, confusion, and curiosity. She had always felt secure in her identity, but now, everything she thought she knew about herself was being called into question. Finally, she looked up at her mother. "I want to meet him." When Amelia called Ethan to tell him Sophie wanted to meet, he felt both exhilarated and terrified. He had imagined this moment for years, what he would say, how he would apologize for everything he had missed. But now that it was actually happening, he felt utterly unprepared. The meeting was arranged at a quiet park near Sophie's college. Ethan arrived early, dressed in his usual tailored suit, but feeling oddly out of place. He sat on a bench, hands clasped tightly as he watched the path for any sign of Sophie. When she finally arrived, his breath caught in his throat. She looked so much like Rachel, with her sharp cheekbones and wavy chestnut hair, but there was something undeniably his about her, too. It was in her confident stride, the set of her jaw, and the piercing green eyes that mirrored his own. Sophie approached cautiously, her expression unreadable. Amelia had offered to come for support, but Sophie had insisted on meeting Ethan alone. She needed to do this her way. "Ethan?" she asked, her voice steady but guarded. He stood, his heart pounding. "Sophie, thank you for agreeing to meet me." She nodded and gestured to the bench. "Shall we sit?" They sat in awkward silence for a moment before Sophie spoke again. "So, you think you're my biological father?" Ethan exhaled, deciding to be as honest as possible. "I don't just think it. I'm almost certain. But I want to start by saying I had no idea you existed until recently. If I had known, things would have been different." Sophie studied him, her expression skeptical. "Why didn't my mom tell you? If she used a donor, wouldn't she have told you before she gave me up?" "That's the part I don't understand," Ethan admitted. "Your mother and I, We didn't part on good terms. She may have felt I wasn't fit to be in your life, but I'm still trying to piece together why she made the choices she did." Sophie leaned back, her arms crossed. "And now? What do you want from me?" Ethan met her gaze, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't want anything from you, Sophie. I know I don't have the right to ask for a place in your life, but if there's any chance I can get to know you, I want to take it. Not as some long-lost father, but as someone who cares about you." Sophie was silent for a long time, her mind racing. Part of her was angry at her mother for keeping this from her, angry at the man sitting beside her for not fighting harder to stay in her life. But another part of her was curious. There was something genuine in Ethan's voice, something that made her want to believe he was telling the truth. "All right," she said finally. "We can start small, but I'm not making any promises." Ethan nodded, relief washing over him. "That's more than I could ask for. Thank you." As Sophie stood to leave, she glanced back at him, her expression softening just slightly. "By the way, I paint. If you want to get to know me, maybe start there." Ethan smiled, a glimmer of hope sparking in his chest. "I'd love that." As Sophie walked away, he knew this was only the beginning of a long road. But for the first time in years, he felt like he had a chance to make things right. The days leading up to Ethan and Sophie's second meeting were a blur of anticipation and nerves. After their initial conversation, Sophie had agreed to let him see her world, the part of her that mattered most to her, her art. Ethan, who had always relied on logic and strategy in his life, felt out of his depth. He had no idea how to connect with someone like Sophie, someone who lived through creativity and emotion. He spent hours researching art movements and painters, trying to grasp the language of her passion. But deep down, he knew no amount of preparation could substitute for sincerity. On a crisp Saturday morning, Sophie invited Ethan to the campus art studio where she spent most of her time. The building was tucked away in a quiet corner of the university, its large windows letting in streams of natural light. When Ethan arrived, he found Sophie waiting outside, her hands stuffed into the pockets of an oversized coat. "You made it," she said simply, a small smile playing on her lips. "Wouldn't miss it," Ethan replied, trying to mask his nervousness. She led him inside, the air smelling faintly of paint and turpentine. The studio was alive with color. Canvases leaned against every available surface, some completed, others works in progress. Brushes, palettes, and jars of paint cluttered the tables, and the hum of quiet creativity filled the space. Ethan had never been anywhere like it. "This is where the magic happens," Sophie said, gesturing to a corner where her work was displayed. Well, some of it anyway. Ethan followed her, his eyes immediately drawn to her paintings. They were bold, vibrant, and deeply personal. One piece, in particular, caught his attention. It was an abstract portrait of a woman with sharp features and piercing green eyes. The figure was fragmented, as if shattered glass had been used to piece her together. "That's beautiful," Ethan said, stepping closer. "Who is she?" Sophie hesitated, her voice soft. "It's me. Or how I felt when I first started painting seriously, like I was figuring out how to put myself together." Ethan nodded, his chest tightening. "You have an incredible gift. You've turned something so complex into something beautiful." Sophie glanced at him, her expression cautious but touched. "Thanks. I've been painting since I was a kid. Mom and Dad, well, Amelia and Thomas, they encouraged it. They always said art was the best way to express what words couldn't." Ethan smiled, though a pang of guilt followed. He hadn't been there to see her take her first steps, pick up her first brush, or find her voice through art. But he could be here now. "I'd love to know more about your work," he said. "What inspires you? What's your process like?" Sophie raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "You actually want to know?" "Of course," Ethan said earnestly. "This is your world. If I'm going to understand you, I want to understand this." For the next hour, Sophie walked Ethan through her paintings, explaining the stories and emotions behind each one. She spoke with a passion that was infectious, her hands gesturing animatedly as she described her techniques and inspirations. Ethan listened intently, soaking in every word. As the conversation flowed, Sophie began to relax. She had expected Ethan to be distant or overly formal, but instead he seemed genuinely interested in her work and who she was. There was still a part of her that held back, wary of getting too close too quickly, but she couldn't deny the connection that was beginning to form. "You know," she said as they stood in front of another painting, "this is the first time I've ever shown someone my work who wasn't already in my life." Ethan looked at her, surprised. "Really? Not even your friends?" She shook her head. "I've always been nervous about sharing it. It feels vulnerable, like letting someone see inside my head." "I'm honored, then," Ethan said sincerely. "Thank you for trusting me." Sophie studied him for a moment, as if trying to read his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. "You're welcome." As they left the studio, Sophie suggested grabbing coffee at a nearby cafe. They settled into a corner booth, the conversation shifting to lighter topics. Ethan told her about his early days as a struggling entrepreneur, the risks he had taken and the lessons he had learned. Sophie listened with interest, occasionally interjecting with sharp-witted comments that made Ethan laugh. "You're not what I expected," Sophie said at one point, sipping her latte. "Oh?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect?" She shrugged, a small smirk on her lips. "I don't know. Some uptight billionaire in a suit who talks about stocks and yachts." Ethan chuckled. "I have a suit and a stock portfolio, but no yacht. I'm afraid I'd be a disappointment." Sophie grinned, her defenses softening further. "Well, you're not as bad as I thought you'd be." "I'll take that as a compliment," Ethan said, smiling. As the day wound down, Sophie walked Ethan to his car. There was still an undercurrent of awkwardness between them, but it was laced with a growing sense of comfort. "Thanks for coming," Sophie said as they stopped by the sleek black sedan. "And for, I don't know, not making this weird." "Thank you for letting me into your world," Ethan replied. "I know this hasn't been easy for you, but I want you to know I'm here, for whatever you need, whenever you're ready." Sophie nodded, a flicker of warmth in her expression. "We'll see. Maybe you'll stick around, maybe you won't. But today was a good start." Ethan smiled, his chest filling with hope. "That's all I could ask for." As Sophie turned and walked away, Ethan leaned against his car, watching her until she disappeared down the street. He knew their journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like they were moving toward something real, something that could finally heal the wounds of the past. The tenuous relationship between Ethan and Sophie was growing, but neither could have prepared for what came next. A few weeks after their second meeting, Amelia called Ethan with unexpected news. "Ethan," she began, her voice uneasy, "I've been looking into Sophie's adoption records." Ethan's pulse quickened. "What did you find?" Amelia hesitated before continuing. "I contacted the agency that handled the adoption. They were reluctant to share anything at first, but after some persistence, they gave me a name, Rachel Blake, your ex-wife." The name hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. "So it's true," he said, his voice low. "Rachel put Sophie up for adoption." "It seems so," Amelia said softly. "But there's more. I requested copies of the medical and genetic records associated with Sophie's adoption. Ethan, they suggest something I didn't expect." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Amelia's voice faltered. "According to the records, Sophie's biological father isn't you." The words landed like a thunderclap. Ethan froze, disbelief washing over him. "That's impossible. Sophie looks just like me." "I know," Amelia said, her tone apologetic. I thought the same thing, but the records show that Rachel used a sperm donor, Thomas, my husband. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the revelation. You're saying Thomas was Sophie's biological father, and Rachel knew? Yes, Amelia confirmed. Rachel must have chosen Thomas as the donor before she placed Sophie for adoption, which means Sophie is biologically his and not yours. Ethan gripped the edge of his desk, his mind reeling. For weeks he had believed Sophie was his daughter, a piece of his past he had lost and was desperate to reclaim. Now he was faced with the realization that his connection to her wasn't biological at all, but through Amelia and Thomas. How do I tell her this? Ethan asked finally, his voice raw. Amelia's voice softened. I don't know, Ethan. Sophie has already had her world turned upside down. We have to be careful how we handle this. Ethan nodded, though his thoughts were still in turmoil. The truth had changed everything, but it also deepened the strange and fateful bond between him and Amelia. Sophie was a part of both their worlds, and now, their shared responsibility. Ethan wrestled with the revelation for days, torn between telling Sophie the truth immediately and waiting for the right moment. Ultimately, he decided to speak with Amelia again before making any decisions. They met at a quiet park where they often talked when Sophie wasn't around. Amelia, Ethan began as they walked along the path. I don't want to lose Sophie. Even if she's not biologically mine, I feel like I've found something I've been missing for years. Amelia gave him a small, understanding smile. I feel the same way. Thomas may have been her biological father, but you've already started building a relationship with her. Biology isn't everything. Ethan stopped walking and turned to her. What do you think we should do? Should we tell her? Amelia sighed, looking conflicted. She deserves to know, Ethan. But we have to be careful. Sophie's just starting to open up to you. If we tell her now, it might make her feel like her entire life has been a lie. Ethan nodded. I don't want to hurt her, I just want her to feel like she belongs, with both of us. Amelia touched his arm lightly. Then we take it slow. Let her trust us first. When the time is right, we'll tell her together. So Ethan agreed, though the weight of the secret was heavy. Over the next few weeks, he continued spending time with Sophie, carefully avoiding the topic of her biological origins. Instead, they focused on getting to know each other, visiting art galleries, trying new coffee shops, and even attending one of Sophie's gallery shows, where Ethan proudly stood in the back and clapped louder than anyone. Sophie was beginning to let her guard down, though she still kept Ethan at arm's length emotionally. One evening, as they sat in a cafe, she finally broached the topic of her adoption. Do you think my biological parents ever think about me? She asked suddenly, her voice tentative. Ethan paused, caught off guard. I can't speak for your biological mother, but if your father were here, I think he'd be incredibly proud of you. Sophie studied him, her eyes searching. And you? Do you ever think about what it would have been like if you had raised me? Ethan's heart ached. He wanted to tell her everything, to explain the truth about Thomas and how fate had brought them all together, but he held back. I think about it all the time, he said honestly, but I'm just grateful for the chance to know you now. Sophie gave him a small smile, but her eyes betrayed her lingering doubts. Ethan could see that she was struggling to reconcile her past with her present. Later that night, as Ethan returned to his penthouse, he received a call from Amelia. Sophie asked me about her adoption today, Amelia said. She's starting to wonder more about where she came from. Ethan sighed. She asked me, too. I don't think we can keep this from her much longer. Amelia agreed. We'll tell her soon, but let's make sure she knows that no matter what, she's loved by both of us. Ethan hung up, his resolve strengthening. Sophie might not be his biological daughter, but she had become a part of his life in a way he hadn't anticipated. And as far as he was concerned, that made her family. The decision to tell Sophie the truth weighed heavily on both Ethan and Amelia. They had spent weeks trying to build trust and a sense of security in her life, knowing that what they were about to reveal could shatter everything. Yet they also understood that Sophie deserved the truth. One Saturday afternoon, they invited her to Amelia's home, where the three of them could talk privately. Sophie arrived looking curious but slightly apprehensive. She had sensed for weeks that something was brewing beneath the surface, but neither of them had said anything directly. "Okay," Sophie said as she settled onto the couch, glancing between Ethan and Amelia. "What's going on? You've both been acting strange lately." Ethan and Amelia exchanged a glance before Amelia spoke, her voice calm but tinged with emotion. "Sophie, there's something we need to tell you. It's about your biological parents and your connection to both Ethan and me." Sophie's brow furrowed, her body tensing. "What do you mean?" Amelia reached out and took Sophie's hand. "Do you remember when I told you that your adoption was closed? That we didn't know much about your biological parents?" Sophie nodded, her expression wary. "Well, after meeting Ethan and learning about his past, we started looking into your adoption records, and what we found is complicated." Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "Sophie, we believed at first that I might be your biological father, but after further research, we discovered something unexpected. Your biological father was Thomas, Amelia's husband." Sophie's eyes widened, her body going rigid. "What? That doesn't make any sense." Amelia nodded, her voice soft but firm. "It's true. Before Thomas and I were married, he was a sperm donor. Your biological mother, Rachel, chose him as the donor when she decided to have a child on her own. Later, for reasons we may never fully understand, she placed you for adoption." Sophie stared at them, her mind reeling. "So, you're saying I'm not his daughter?" She pointed at Ethan, her voice rising slightly. "You're saying I'm Thomas's daughter?" Ethan's chest tightened at the hurt in her voice. "That's what the records show. But Sophie, I want you to know this doesn't change how I feel about you. I care about you deeply. Not because of biology, but because of who you are." Sophie stood abruptly, pacing the room as she tried to process the revelation. "This is insane. My whole life I thought I was just a normal kid who got lucky with great adoptive parents. Now you're telling me I'm the result of some sperm donor program, and that my biological father is dead?" Amelia rose and approached her cautiously. "Sophie, I know this is a lot to take in, but Thomas loved children, even though he never got to meet you. If he had known about you, I'm certain he would have been proud of the person you've become." Sophie stopped pacing and turned to face them, her eyes filling with tears. "And you," she said, looking at Ethan, "why did you even bother getting involved? If I'm not your daughter, why do you care so much?" Ethan stood, his voice thick with emotion. "Because I see so much of myself in you, not in the biological sense, but in your strength, your independence, and your determination to follow your passion. When I first thought you might be my daughter, I wanted a chance to make up for all the mistakes I made in my past. But even after learning the truth, I realized I don't want to walk away. I want to be here for you, however you'll let me." Sophie wiped her eyes, her emotions swinging between anger, sadness, and a flicker of gratitude. "This is so much to process. I don't even know what to think right now." Amelia stepped closer, her voice gentle. "Take all the time you need, Sophie. We're here for you no matter what." Sophie looked at both of them, her defenses softening slightly. "I don't know what this all means yet, but I guess I'm glad you told me." The weeks that followed were challenging, but they brought a sense of clarity. Sophie spent time reflecting on the revelation, often retreating to her studio to paint through her emotions. Amelia and Ethan gave her space but stayed close, offering support whenever she needed it. Slowly, Sophie began to rebuild her sense of identity. She realized that while her origins were complex, they didn't define who she was. She was still the same person, an artist, a dreamer, and a fiercely independent young woman. Ethan and Amelia also found themselves growing closer. The shared experience of helping Sophie navigate her new reality created a bond between them that neither had expected. They started spending more time together, finding comfort in their shared purpose and mutual respect. Months later, Sophie invited Ethan and Amelia to an art exhibition where one of her pieces had been selected for display. The gallery was buzzing with excitement, but Ethan's attention was solely on Sophie. She stood by her painting, beaming as people admired her work. When the event wound down, Sophie approached Ethan and Amelia with a small smile. "Thanks for coming. It means a lot to me." Ethan nodded, his voice warm. "We wouldn't miss it for the world." Sophie hesitated before adding, "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what you both told me. And I've realized something. It doesn't matter how I got here or where I came from. What matters is the people who care about me now. And you two, you've been here for me in ways I never expected." Amelia smiled, her eyes glistening. "We'll always be here for you, Sophie, no matter what." Ethan's voice was steady but filled with emotion. "Your family, Sophie, in every way that counts." Sophie nodded, a genuine smile breaking across her face. "I think I'm finally okay with that." As they left the gallery together, the three of them felt a sense of peace. Their story was far from traditional, but it was theirs. A story of love, resilience, and the unexpected ways people can find each other. For Ethan, Amelia, and Sophie, the future was no longer about the past they had lost, but the family they had built together, a new beginning filled with hope and possibility.